Good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Sociallinguistics here to do a presentation from the Oxford Handbook of Language and Race by Sammy Aline, Reyes, and Cross-Riddy. And the title of this is Chapter 8 is What Does a Terrorist Sound Like? Language and Racialization Representations of Muslims. And this is by Karim Khan. The abstract of this here is, in other words, you've all heard before, you speak English so well. You speak good English, or you're so articulate, or only a few examples of microcultural practices that seem blatantly rationalizing, but instead reproduce racist meanings and reinforce racializing regimes. This chapter discusses processes of racial linguistic exceptionalism in which exceptionalism arises through white racist evaluation of and ideologies about both language and race, to consider how beliefs about marginalized groups and their speech serve to reinforce racist narratives about Asians, blacks, indigenous people, Latinos, and so forth. Racial linguistics exceptionalism, according to this chapter, is pernicious since it is exceptionalizes the homogenizes people at the same time while staying contemporary, and that is contingent on one's most recent performance. It analyzes, further demonstrates that the process of racial linguistic exceptionalisms manifest themselves in different ways among racialized groups, whose histories have been shaped by various forms of colonialism, enslavement, occupation, racial segregation, and other forms of racist global capitalization or capitalism. The fear and suspicion of Muslim bodies is not simply a ramification of post 9/11 hysteria, but rather a reanimating of long-standing images of Muslim in cultural discourse. What does a potential terrorist look like? And as a result, words and language associated with Muslims have become emblematic as an enemy within. Spiller and his colleagues, what does a terrorist or extremist sound like, is further query that a social linguistic might pose. This chapter looks at 4 instances of racial linguistic profiling, and that link particular terms and languages to Muslims as security hazards, particularly in contexts of education and travel in the United Kingdom and the United States. Say points out that a large portion of how the West views Muslims has been formed discursively through text and representation seen through Western eyes. He also claims that the threat of jihad is concealed under all these images in regards to cinema. Consequences, events like the 2011 Paris attacks on Charlie Hebdo, and the 2005, the London bombing, in contrast to 9/11, which was carried out by foreign nationals. Now, during the war on terror, it is now socially acceptable to create an Islamic adversary abroad and due to their shared religions, their beliefs, domestic enemy, and as being created along similar lines. Many people wonder why these seemingly normal people would turn into terrorists. Or the treatment of Muslims, sometimes the unfair treatment of colored people, bears no resemblance to either the history of the United States or the history of the United Kingdom. In response to a specific enemy, there has been an increasing emphasis on foreseeing a threat before a catastrophe occurs through preemptive knowledge and interventions which aim to predict what may happen with future-centric modeling. Such as in World War II, the Japanese were interred as parts of racism. They were interred here in the United States, but the war was in the Pacific. Preemptive theory's foundations is the joining of coordinate points along a path that connects point A of shared characteristics with point B of terrorism. Being Muslim alone causes a threat to be assumed, and the second error has to do with travel. Because of the prejudice against Muslims, Blackwood and colleagues in 2013 discovered that every Muslim participant had an airport tale of how they were treated unfairly. Profiling and regimes of shibboleth consciousness. The Gilamites were going home after an interethnical conflict with the Ephraimites. And in this tense situation, the Gilamites underwent a language test to determine who was a friend or foe, and the ability to correctly pronounce the word shibboleth, which means ear of corn, is now the Giladites were distinguished between the Ephraimites and the Giladites. Are you from Ephraim? And he said, no. And they would demand that he recite the shibboleth right away. And because he was unable to pronounce it properly, he simply said shibboleth. And the shibboleth serves as a symbol for both the individual and the language. Shibboleth is compared as a circumcision by Derrida, who also claims that the Jews, the word Jew, likewise trades places with shibboleth against it. And Jew is the shibboleth before even using the vowel or becoming its victim, before any separation, whether communitarian or discriminatory, whether safe or lost, master or exile, original emphasis. In addition to serving as a metaphor for the outsider and the excluded, this idea of the Jew includes marginalized groups like immigrants, refugees, and in the case in this chapter, Muslims. The idea of the Jew is literally an acknowledgement of the past, the persecution of the Jewish community. The Shibboleth metaphor is expanded by McNamara and Rovero to include more typical daily circumstances. And according to them, the commonplace events constitute regimes of shibboleth consciousness. Now, the shibboleth firstly speaks of language in general instead than just one word. Second, the shibboleth conditions the nature of social relations. And third, compliance is required. Failure to conform can have serious social and political repercussions. The shibboleth had a watchful quality that contributes to respectable force. Discipline and punish makes references to panoptic surveillance techniques. And Derrida initially draws a connection between the examination of Foucault's work and the shibboleth as describing it as the guerrilla work of policing of normalization and the methodological subjugations. Some people are targeted more than others by this policing and surveillance because they are compared to the power of the norm. And that is so that surveillance can be carried out by evaluating language behaviors. Now, insecurity, surveillance, and language is a method with political overtones. It presents our reality as being perilous and infested with insecurities, how safety is maintained. There is a method of knowing, representing, and engaging not only creates new worlds of hazards, but also interprets worlds already full with risk. Hasselmann's surveillance is the purposeful, routine, systematic, and focused attention paid to personal details for the sake of control, entitlement, and management in the utterance of protection. Security are susceptible to discriminatory practices. Insecurity is not only related to policies, but also everyday practices which may become political acts. The very nature of knowledge itself and the discursive construction of threats and suspicion. Who breaches or poses a threat to safety within our national story is determined by a set of factors that identify the amount of group membership, both inside and outside of the state. Racism is practiced on the behalf of the state. But thus narratives that draw on nationalism can include racist defenses of how to treat specific groups and people who are taught not to be a part of a created essence of oneness. Thus, persons who appear to be Muslims are subject to restrictions in their freedom and travel, and the increase in terrorist threats provides a sufficient justification of such classification, which are mostly based on race and religion rather than objective data. The othering of brown bodies favors whiteness because of the lack of racial connections to the perceived threat. This is frequently demonstrated in an overly attentive treatment of travelers with known brown skin in airports, language, race, and security surveillance. Well, the requirements to appear to be doing more to combat Islamic terrorism inside this enhanced surveillance necessitates finding an increasing variety of this hardening of nationalist attitude that has opened the door for acceptable anti-Islamic xenophobic views of a larger setting, and these links between insecurity language, Muslims, in relations to the state and everyday life. Life means that languages is highly rationalized, scrutinized, and if threats come emanating from the enemy within. And of these threats, it can be created through the use of languages. Discourse portrays of Muslims as the folk evil in opposition to the purity of English, creating a sort of classic civilization myth. It is clear that the rationalization is clearly targeted as immigrants when the concept incorporates the requirements to learn English. But studying the Muslim, well, both of the examples in this section are from British education and context, that there are the 4 P's: prevent, with fight extremism and radicalization, protect the public after an attack, pursue the terrorists, and prepare for terrorist attacks. Prevent has by far been the most divisive counterterrorism tactic among the various contested weapons. Islamophobic and institutionalized with the emphasis of Muslim. One of the prevent's curious and maybe evil features is that by using imprecise language, it broadens the scope of surveillance rather than narrowing it down. The Counterterrorism and Security Act, which established the prevent responsibility under Article 26 of that act, was passed in 2015. It meant that individuals in a variety of occupations, including as doctors and teachers, were now required by law to report those exhibiting signs of radicalization. The teacher is also a security expert, and the classroom is not only a place for learning, but also a place of conflicting ideologies where students are not only learners, but also potential terrorists. This securitized educational setting means that the roles of those involved were racially adulterated. Later, the students would be asked to discuss the surroundings in a French lesson, and this one student spoke out and what he had learned about the protesters chaining trees to prevent their removals. And he labeled these efforts in French as écoterrorisme, using a new term that he had just acquired, shibboleth, in the childcare of Luton near London. A 4-year-old was sketching a year later in 2016, and he drew an image of his father. And according to reports, when the instructor inquired about the photo, the youngster responded that his dad was sawing a cuckoo-bomb, and the child was referred to channel for radicalization, even though the child's father was aware of this and how the child pronounced cucumber because his teachers mistook it for cooker bomb. And the social ordeal is changed by the shibboleth of cuckoo bomb and the redistribution's risk in favor of the child. However, the teacher's ear picks on the word bomb. However, the child is more influenced by how his words are perceived than by what he actually said. It is doubtful that the interpretation would have been as heavily influenced by security discourses if the boy had not been a Muslim. There is a chance about the Shibboleth could be used against the speaker. And Shibboleth belonging to everyone, not just the kids, but also belongs to their professors, whose perception is shaped by the discursive construction of Muslims as potential terrorists. Now, how about traveling while Muslim? Both the ensuing instances take place in the United States. Both cases are located in busy travel corridors. And the first occurs in an airport, whereas the second occurs on a bus. The airport plays a unique monitoring role since it evaluates travelers' mobility and assigns them to different risk categories according to how reliable they are. And I must admit that the man who was being dragged from the plane carried himself to the jet bridge. And I believed that the work of Southwest was violent in its treatment for him. And he wasn't a very kind man. He attempted to communicate with me in Arabic, but I was unable to understand him, so I requested that he would do so in English. Well, the observer once questioned Makazum, why are you speaking Arabic? You are aware of how hazardous the environment is. This is by CNN. And having his language and vehicle inspected by sniffer dogs, Makazum was taken into custody and questioned by the FBI agents. Makazum had some light in the line of questioning he encountered. He claimed that the FBI officer told him, you need to be really honest with us and what you said about the martyrs. And according to CNN, informed us of the martyrs' details that you are aware of. Makasum cleared all standard security checks before boarding the aircraft, and therefore the incarceration actually had more to do with the language by phone call and him as a speaker than it did with any security issues that were currently in place. The example of Makazum is intriguing since it represents a type of horizontal surveillance and a reverse to advice from a peer rather than an organizational or authoritative figure of this situation. It could be a fellow traveler. The passenger is unaware of any other information about Makazum and lacks any security experience. And although he was ambiguously stated that both passengers had a common language, it is unclear to what extent the passenger is fluent in Arabic. This is significant since the security claim is supported by situational subjective information from a non-expert. This is a typical instance of see it, say it. Singh was an Indian national who applied for asylum in the United States. And Singh was not a Muslim. In contrast to the other examples in this chapter, he was a Sikh, and as frequently the case of followers of the religion, and he had a beard. He spent a month in an immigration detention facility in Arizona, and a day following his release, he boarded a Greyhound bus and bound for Indianapolis from Phoenix. Well, he was on the bus. He found the process of mugging particularly offensive. The publication of Sheehan's mugshot in international news cost him great embarrassment and anger, and without his turban. It only took a readable phrase of language to serve as a shibboleth to draw the terrifying line between belonging and discrimination. And though the threat of brown guys, one wearing a turban who appeared to be speaking Arabic but aren't actually speaking it, is enough to cause alarm. In the discussion of the chapter, when someone is being evaluated, especially in a spoken language environment, the assessor is frequently an expert or is in some other manner considered to have more knowledge. The evaluation in the four situations in this chapter are exceptional, that the assessed is more linguistically proficient than the assessor. Understanding the disproportionate authority given that the assessor is based on such shaky and scant information requires an understanding of the politics of knowing, and observes how people with limited credentials are increasingly assumed competence in matters related to terrorism. Sageman bemoans the fact that there are still few explanations of why white people turn or become terrorists due to the low status of terrorism research. Despite the fact that the radicalization argument is flawed, politicians nonetheless advocate it. There are racial repercussions to this acceptance of dubious scientific data. And according to Silva, the selective adoption of research results in media and government discourse alike to act as unknowingly in the acknowledgement of institutionalized bias and analogous to the concept of colorblind racism, in which discriminatory social policies are justified by the adoption of specific types of academic research and ignoring of others. Illustrated above.
That's this one.
Sorry. And when it comes to the four people in this chapter, it has been a rush to spot an indication of suspicion. In order to anticipate the future, one must engage in hyperactive preemptive prejudice, and often known as crystal ball gazing. And by rejecting knowledge, people will become more receptive to media and political dialogue. People have had enough of specialists. Despite their own lack of experience, the white listener can make judgments based on language and a perceived risk and never face allegations of racism. There are two levels to this. One on more legislative level. The accusers are always safeguarded by law or some type of internal working mechanisms and referral process that penalize the support of Muslims. And whites' intentions were prioritized over the racist consequences of their behavior and violence against people of color. And as a result, the presumptions of lack of intention offers a handy of defense against accusations of racism. The whites' only defense reduces racial consequences from highly violent occurrence to an erroneous interpretation of an unintentional result of apparently benign indeed. And second, the idea of white innocence plays a significant role in the upkeep of white ignorance. White ignorance, according to Wecker, is founded on not knowing as well as not wanting to know. The white person who is being overheard is a protected party. The ability to refer innocent Muslims is available to the white listener. And the white listening subject is supported by a professional white listening subject who can decide that it is preferable to be safe than sorry in this situation. However, politics and politicians basically choose who is and is not a terrorist and what constitutes an act of terrorism without the necessity for evidence and without even commonly agreed definition of who constitutes terrorism and terrorism. Since the decision to act is made by teachers and passengers, their actions are political rather than legal, and the handling of people in the four cases is made possible by pre-crime terrorist extremists framework because the accusations have little impact in the courtroom, where evidence, due process, and presumption of innocence would be necessary. Now, Muslims are completely exposed to racism, which contrasts sharply with their shedding from charges of racism, not of their age. Muslim people who look to be Muslim can have a significant impact, even with the seemingly innocent gestures. The fact that assessments can be made at any time and anywhere make Muslims consistently open to scrutiny and misunderstanding. The promiscuity of the surveillance drive, Cheyenne, is so obscene that the unjust treatment is given to people who look like and sound like Muslims. Our attention must be focused on both Muslims and the white listener subject, who makes Muslim invisible and consistently always suspect in all kinds of incidents and in those to come. Contrary to the radicalization interpretation of Muslims' guilt and criminality, the white listener is frequently assumed to be innocent, and their ignorance is not questioned. Further studies should go more on how those listening techniques work and how they advance the goals of the state.